I would like to introduce Navlika Ratangee. She's the managing director of ICAS in South Africa. So like I said, we know ICAS also here in the city of Belgium, and she's going to talk about well-being. And well-being is such an important topic. We have seen it during COVID, how important it is. So I'm happy to give the word and the floor to Navlika.
Thanks so much, David, for the introduction. And yes, you're absolutely right. ICAS is a global organization, and we do have offices in Belgium as well. So it's great to know that you do know the organization in your own country. So my topic today is really just focusing on well-being, as David said, but honing in on the fact that the future of work is employee well-being. So it really does sort of position what are we talking about when we're talking about the future of work. The truth is that we have faced quite a lot of disruption in the context of the pandemic. Even prior to the pandemic, if we think about the role of 4IR, digitization, the fast pace of change that we've all been exposed to, but we certainly are facing a lot more disruption in the future. So we'll unpack that in a little bit more detail together with what we're talking about when we look at the context of the future world of work through the lens of well-being. Why is mental health so topical at this point? And why is it going to be even more topical in the future? We're going to end off then with just positioning the fact that employee well-being is leader-led and all this buzz around organizational purpose. So I'm just making sure that the slides are moving on in front of all of you. Thanks. We can go to the next slide. Great. So the truth is that there are many buzzwords that are being used at the moment for both current and future world of work. And this includes creating organizations with purpose. So I purposely put a picture of a pressure pot on this particular slide because we are all facing disruption. A short while ago, Dr. Jerry Gould was chatting to everyone about VUCA and the fact that the V for vulnerability needs to change to V for velocity. There's another format that says VUCA D, where the D stands for disruption. And I'm going to introduce yet another concept where some futurists are saying actually that the V for vulnerability needs to change to the V for volatility needs to change to V for vulnerability. And what I really like about that is that it's really putting the human back in the center of everything that we're doing. So some of these buzzwords are about how do we create an organization with purpose, that I feel like I belong, I feel like I'm contributing positively, I feel that we are doing good as an organization. That we are creating a culture of care. Now, in this context of remote working as well, we just need to be mindful that the culture of care needs to actually permeate into those virtual spaces as well. And that actually creating a virtual culture of care needs to be an intentional and purposeful exercise. It's not just automatic. It doesn't happen by osmosis that if we can create that environment within the workspace, that it's necessarily going to permeate into the virtual space as well. We talk about workplace flexibility as being a key ingredient in terms of creating the workplace of the future as well, a workplace that employees are able to thrive. And this entire concept around caring for myself, caring for my mental health, caring for those around me. I'm sure many people have heard the sort of slogan that just be kind. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others. So these are just some of the critical ingredients that an employee is looking for in choosing their workplace, a workplace of their choice. HR has had to rethink their people strategies and their policies to not only attract talent, but also to ensure talent retention. We want to create workplaces that focus on holistic well-being. It's not good enough, or gone are the days really, where employers say, when you come to the workplace, you leave your personal problems at the door. You're here to work, and we care about the output, we care about the performance, and we put all the workplace structures in place to enhance performance. So that more and more employers are taking the responsibility now to ensure that that sort of mindset is shifting to say that it is our responsibility to ensure that employees feel well, that employees feel like they can thrive. And that includes the fact that we see this person as a whole being. We can't separate out their work lives and personal lives. We have to see them as holistic individuals if we are to really get employee engagement and employee productivity at the end of the day, that these start to become non-negotiable ingredients. Employees want to know that their employers care about their well-being. This focus on nurturing employee well-being is critical to developing workplace resilience, another word that really sort of crops up quite a lot in terms of a future skill set. In fact, it's a current skill set that's needed. But certainly in the future world of work, it is a non-negotiable skill set that is needed. And on two fronts, individual resilience, but also workplace resilience. How resilient is the organization to the challenges that it's going to face? And that is made up of the employees that work at the organization. And what are their personal resiliency skills? So it becomes important for workplaces to focus on these things to ensure that they can then survive and thrive as an organization. So in this fast-paced environment of change, employees want choice. And the truth is that they have choice in terms of looking at which organization they want to work for. So if we move over to the next slide, and again, focusing on the fact that we are operating in a fast-paced environment. In this fast-paced environment, we are seeing a communication deficit. And isn't that quite ironic that we have more and more digital tools to enable connection, to enable communication? And whilst we are very grateful for those things, because imagine being stuck in a pandemic at a time where we couldn't use technology to connect with one another. That would be a whole different experience. But yet we talk about this communication deficit. And it really comes from the thinking that as human beings, we are social beings. Our brains are social organs. At any given point in time, we are busy processing ourselves in relation to another. So we're always thinking about, I wonder what that person thought about me when I said X, Y, and Z. I wonder why that person reacted in that way when I did this. I wonder why I felt so triggered when person X did this or said this. So we always processing things in relation to another. Human beings are social beings, and as social beings, we need human connection to survive. And in this world where we're now starting to talk about and experience a communication deficit and even a connection deficit, it really comes from the space of saying, that we are losing that social connection with one another as we see the rate of digitization increasing, because that human connection is missing in a lot of these different platforms. So, one of the key drivers of mental health concerns now and into the future is the advent and the increase of loneliness. Now, where does this come from? Again, directly linked to this connection deficit. Now, remember, loneliness is not about being alone, which is more actually referred to as social isolation. So, a large part of the global community has been facing social isolation, forced social isolation as a result of the pandemic. And that would start to now make sense in terms of the increase in mental health concerns that we are seeing. So, this increase in social isolation has resulted in the increase in loneliness. And in fact, many people are still struggling with social anxiety, that is linked to sort of coming back out there and connecting with people again. That there is a real anxiety that is associated with that. But when we talk about loneliness, we are also talking about the fact that people may very well feel completely alone, even if they're in a room full of people. And that starts to really point to the mental health concerns that we are seeing. We know that there's been an increase in mental health concerns, not just from the pandemic. I know that wellbeing has received such a massive spotlight as a result of the pandemic, which is really a positive, because it was sort of long awaited where this was taken seriously. But the truth is that mental health concerns have been on the rise long before the pandemic. Globally, the statistics are 1 in every 4 people that will struggle with a mental health concern at some point in their lives. Again, globally, megatrends pointed to the fact that we're moving towards 1 in every 2 people that will struggle with mental health concerns at some point in their lives. And that statistic is forecasted to about 2050. Unfortunately, as a result of the pandemic and very recent studies that came out just this year, in a global context, but also in a South African context, we're starting to see results that reflect that up to 80% of the workforce is struggling already now with mental health concerns. This is far more than the 1 in every 2 that was predicted from a global megatrend perspective. So it becomes a real key focal area that if we're not already focusing on mental health concerns, that we absolutely need to be, because it is the next pandemic. It is being dubbed as the next pandemic. And if you knew what you knew now, around the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure you would have done things a little bit differently to prepare better for the pandemic, whether it's on an individual perspective or whether it's on an organizational perspective. So the question is, if you know that mental health is going to be the next pandemic, what are you already doing to prepare better for that as an individual, but also as an organization? Another scary statistic is the fact that there's a suggestion that by the year 2030, which is really around the corner, that up to 80% of the workforce will experience depressive symptoms. And where we find ourselves at this point in time, where we see anxiety manifesting in the workplace a lot more commonly than depression, both anxiety and depression often coexist, and they're spoken about almost in one sentence. They are separate sort of symptoms, separate diagnoses, but we do see them as the most common mental illness related symptoms that we are talking about. The truth is that previous pandemics have shown us that the population struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anywhere from 2 to 6 years post a pandemic. We are not really post-pandemic as yet, but yet we are seeing the increase in people struggling with anxiety already. The other thing to really be focused on as well when we talk about this picture of holistic well-being and the future world of work is that there's more and more emphasis being placed on environmental well-being. And what are we doing as people and as organizations when we talk about creating organizations with purpose? What impact are we leaving on the environment? And so environmental well-being is also really being placed front and center of this well-being conversation as a whole. As we start unpacking that even further, and that hybrid working has become part of a norm in terms of many people keeping that as a framework, some people working from home, some people coming into the office, having the flexibility to choose. It's also important to recognize the role that well-being plays in the hybrid context. So as much as there are positives in terms of that flexibility, performance, productivity, in making those decisions, how do we create spaces for people to still connect with each other meaningfully, so that they don't create the more loneliness from a workplace perspective? And that's also the conversation about extending this culture of care to a virtual culture of care. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. So a lot of people ask the questions around generations. Is this mental health and well-being conversation a generational thing? The truth is, from a generational perspective, just to give you some feedback, and this came from a Deloitte report, it shared that over the past 2 years, 44% of millennials and 49% of Gen Zs said that they have made choices over the type of work they prepare to do and the organizations for which they are willing to work for based on their personal ethics. And so this is coming through more and more. And this translates into overall employee engagement. A more recent Gartner survey found that when an organization acted on today's social issues, so again, that organization of purpose coming through, the proportion of workers who were considered highly engaged increased from 40% to 60%. So this is really important when we think about future world of work again. And the truth is that mental health and well-being is not a generational thing. But what we are seeing is that the younger generations are feeling more comfortable to talk about it. And we need to create the platforms for people to talk openly about it. Another angle to really look at this as well is potentially 50% of jobs are disappearing by 2025. 50% of the jobs that we know today won't exist in 2025. And 47% of occupational categories were at high risk of being automated. So that brings into the question, what skills are needed for the future? How do we attract top talent? How do we create the platform from a future world of work perspective? And one of the key drivers is teamwork and collaboration. We need to create those contexts in our workplaces. And again, we need to bring this conversation of mental health to the fore. I'm going to end on this slide because I know the 20 minutes have really rushed by, but I really just want to leave everybody with this concept around destigmatizing mental health in the workplace, and the fact that it is so critically important to spend time on this now when we think about the future world of work as well. Often people use the terms mental health and mental illness interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. They exist on the same continuum, and the truth is that each and every single one of us can dip into mental health or mental illness at any given point on any given day. And it's the kind of things that we are practicing on a day-to-day basis that actually starts to balance that beam. So we all have bad days. We all have difficulties making decisions. We all struggle with change. And all of that dips into mental illness related symptoms. So a person with a higher chance of mental illness exposed to any type of stress, and who on this call I can say that they're not experiencing any type of stress, will show symptoms of mental illness. And that causes more stress. And when we're exposed to more stress, it reinforces that cycle where we present with a higher chance of mental illness. And that is how that cycle works. So we worry about the educational system being able to support the changes that are needed in the world of work. But what about employee well-being? So we need to take this platform, we need to use the opportunity to talk about work-life integration, to talk about mental health, to create future fit organizations and to create future fit individuals. We need to be talking about building those resiliency skills and even building pro-resiliency skills, which is more proactive. How do we anticipate the challenges that are coming before we feel like we fall off the wagon and then have to build ourselves up and bounce back up again? So I hope that you had some valuable pieces of information in this very short conversation today. And I'd like to hand back to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Navlika. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Now, a lot of organizations have this masculine culture, which is kind of violent and which has no place for frailty and fragility and weakness, to use the word. Do you think that we have seen the light after the pandemic and our leaders now really genuinely inclined to invest in well-being and to adapt, I would say, culture and behavior for people, so that they can thrive and not be lonely and not be under overly stress and so on? Do you think that has evolved?
Yeah, I think there's so much happening. That question is so loaded, and there's so many different angles to take in terms of responding to that. So if I can maybe just focus on two things. The first, I do believe that there are shifts that are happening. People have seen the light and have seen the importance of focusing on employee well-being, and that we can't actually run organizations successfully without having considered the impact that work is having on employee well-being, that life is having on employee well-being. There is a study that I saw, and it does relate to global statistics as well, that 88% of organizations are more willing to spend on mental health interventions. So that's positive to see how that's actually playing out. In real terms, I think, we're starting to see that unfold. But the other area that I want to touch on in terms of your question is that leaders are particularly overwhelmed with this conversation around well-being. They know that it's important, but they're saying, how do we do this? How do we create a culture of care? How do we do this differently? And they are needing support in terms of starting to shift that workplace narrative.
Yeah.
And in fact, they themselves are struggling because they are also compromised in terms of higher levels of mental illness and higher levels of burnout just by virtue of their position in the
Okay.
organization.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for your great presentation. And we have to go on. This is a marathon of inspiration. So have a great day in South Africa.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
David, and enjoy the rest of the Inspire Run.
Yeah. Okay.